Hi, I'm Sanna Ali, and I'm presenting our paper, Walking the Walk of AI Ethics, Organizational Challenges and the Individualization of Risk Among Ethics Entrepreneurs. This project is a joint collaboration between myself and my co-authors, Angèle, Christin, Andrew Smart, and Riitta Katila. So here at FACT, there have been a lot of work around new tools and processes that practitioners can use in their development of new algorithmic systems. However, journalists and academics have claimed that companies are merely ethics watching and co-opting ethics. Our team wanted to know what it looked like on the ground when ethics tools and processes are brought to organizations to be implemented. The literature on AI ethics in practice has focused a lot on critiques of principles, in that AI principles are vague and limited. And there's been some work on the various obstacles to implementation. So Holstein et al. Identified tooling needs of practitioners, and Sanna, Raji, and William give some recommendations to make audits more effective. But these studies don't account for organizational dynamics that lead to these obstacles. Finally, Metcalf, Moss, and Boyd argue that institutional logics around technological solutionism, meritocracy, and market fundamentalism create the potential for ethics owners to be unable to address the broader goal of a more just, algorithmic, and data-driven world. So while this study identifies the ideological contradictions inherent in AI ethics work, we build on this work and seek to map out the concrete organizational roadblocks that instantiate and complement these abstract logics. So our research questions are, how are ethics initiatives and interventions implemented in AI product development cycles in practice? What are the organizational barriers to implementation? To better understand this, we turn to organizational theory and the literature on institutional change, which states that there are two sources. First, exogenous jolts or environmental pressures, for example, the tech flash. However, these pressures are often not enough to produce true institutional change due to decoupling, and instead they act as the first stage, precipitating the second, which is endogenous action from actors embedded within organizations, who can then facilitate the diffusion and adoption of new practices. So what does that look like? Well, first let's talk about decoupling. Without decoupling, in an ideal scenario, you have formal policies, which are then implemented into daily practices, which then produce the intended outcome. However, with policy practice decoupling, the formal policies are not actually implemented into daily practices, so they may or may not produce the intended outcome. And finally, with means-ends decoupling, which is more common in contemporary organizations, formal policies are indeed implemented into practice, but they are not necessarily tied to outcomes. So for example, the implementation of certain diversity programs like mandatory trainings in large corporations is largely ceremonial. So they might not always be effective, and they're implemented, but symbolically. And so means-ends decoupling is more prevalent in contexts when outcomes are hard to measure and when the rationalized environment is fragmented. So drawing on this characterization, the case of AI ethics appears to be a good candidate for means-ends decoupling. So in this case, we need a better understanding of the individual and interpersonal dynamics in which institutional change in the technology industry therefore depends. So institutional entrepreneurs, in this case, ethics workers that we are interviewing, break with its dominant institutional rules, practices, and logics, and institutionalize an alternative they're championing through theorization, negotiations, strategically framing their projects, mobilizing coalitions, and generating collective action. So the sample that we interviewed was 25 individuals. They were employees, academics, and consultants, primarily ethics workers, currently or formerly employed as part of a responsible AI initiative at technology companies. Our sample is highly educated, 96% held graduate degrees, fairly diverse in terms of gender and ethnicity, and also diverse in terms of disciplinary background. So people had engineering backgrounds, social science, philosophy, etc. And this is reflected in their job titles, which were similarly diverse: researcher, engineer, program manager. And this was also a big challenge. Many people declined to participate due to non-disclosure agreements, advisement from the legal team at their company about intellectual property, other concerns around privacy, or undisclosed reasons. So this is a challenge that for future research as well. So what did we find? The first thing that we found was that participants were pleasantly surprised by how agreeable product teams were. Kate, a PhD student who had worked at multiple companies in AI ethics related roles, said, everyone's like, oh, I want to do this. I'm happy to help you. I'm happy to participate. Despite these positive reactions, ethics workers still faced challenges when it came to implementation of recommendations or practices. So what was going on? The leadership buy-in was there to an extent in that ethics workers were being hired. However, there wasn't enough to actually give them the authority to mandate changes or resources such as time and personnel for data labeling, which led in turn to the individualization of responsibility to affect change. And given this individualization, ethics issues were inconsistently addressed. So what are the barriers faced by ethics workers in this environment where they lack authority and resources? The first one we'll discuss is product innovation as the highest priority. I mentioned earlier that means-ends decoupling can emerge when there's a fragmented, rationalized environment. In the case of AI ethics, the technology industry assumes product innovation as the core task of the organization, while environmental pressures emphasize values like fairness and justice. In this section, I present the ways in which the goals of frequent product innovation supersedes goals related to responsible AI if it's not siloed entirely. So some of the ways in which this manifests is that product managers are responsible for the timeline, the resources, and the product decisions. And so if ethics entrepreneurs' recommendations are likely to delay timelines for product launches, they will encounter resistance. Sam, who previously worked at a big tech company but transitioned to a nonprofit, said, they might be like, we don't have time for this. We have to get to launch. No one was antagonistic to it. There was more just this pressure to get this thing out. So in the face of these challenges, AI ethics entrepreneurs employed various interpersonal strategies, such as networking to identify allies and influential team members, concentrating efforts on motivating already interested parties, encouraging early engagement in the product development lifecycle, focusing on making ethics tools easier to use, and reframing issues in terms of mutual interest. So for example, Kate said, I very rarely say fairness or ethics or anything like that because that's a loaded word. I really try to go to product team with the idea that I'm here to help you make a better product. In my experience, in the way that organizations work, everyone can get behind making better products. So there was a wide variation in interactions, and that meant that interpersonal dynamics could take precedent in how a matter unfolded. So Parker, a former engineer and ethics worker at a big technology company, said that just as often as a team would blow you off, there'd be some team somewhere doing something relevant that had one person who's interested in talking to you or working with you. So it depends so much. Some teams you're totally siloed from, and some teams are so excited to work with you and want you to do audits. This resulted in inconsistency in how and whether specific issues were addressed. The second barrier that AI ethics workers face was company goals being operationalized through metrics. So in one case, that was problematic in that the prioritization of product was operationalized through North Star metrics like daily active users and customer lifetime value, essentially metrics that value engagement or monetization. Some product teams assumed that any intervention to improve fairness would degrade their models, make them less accurate, or affect their ability to meet revenue targets. So ethics entrepreneurs had to preemptively assuage those fears. Not only that, but they also were pressured to determine, measure, and provide quantitative evidence for their own ethics-related goals. And if their recommendations were counter to North Star metrics, they were required to provide irrefutable quantitative evidence, which is hard to come by in this area. So Dave says, no matter how much people want to do a good job, at the end of the day, quarterly goals will get in the way, whether it's revenue or monthly users that your job depends on. The early advice I got was if you could ever get the CEO to say, okay, one of our North Star metrics is related to ethics or fairness, that would have just changed everything. And the third barrier that AI ethics workers face was the frequent reorganizations of teams and workers within the organization. So James, a PhD intern at a big tech company, ended up having 3 different bosses over the course of his 3-month internship. And he said, the reshuffling, the reordering is supposedly a company-wide policy for continuous optimization and continuous iteration. The way you could do constant A/B tests on your personnel and your corporate structure, just like you do constant A/B tests on your platform for user engagement checks. This organizational practice that is well suited to an agile, product-centered environment meant that James' team had 3 different bosses over the course of this 3-month internship, and that he was unable to access institutional knowledge that might help him do his job better and avoid repeating previously attempted projects. Importantly, in the context of our other findings, it could also mean that relationships that ethics entrepreneurs had taken time to build and depended on for their work were disrupted, creating additional friction and inefficiency to implement ethics. So given these three barriers, there are additional implications for whether ethics work gets done. First, there's a risk to individuals. Dave, who left his previous company for this reason, said, I was going to be in a position where if something did, an issue surfaced close to or after launch, I would be the one to see it and basically need to be the whistleblower. And I realized there were really no protections in place for me. And the stress level that was causing was not really being acknowledged. Ethics workers can be in a position of being put under unreasonable pressure. It's just kind of not acknowledging how much pressure that puts people who are often not senior enough to be making those decisions. And while Dave was white, many of our participants talked about the risk to marginalized individuals in particular. Aisha, a Black PhD student who worked at many different technology companies, said the people who are actually invested in it as like a call to action, as a vocation, and as a means for social change are the ones who inhabit marginalized identities. She describes in the pushback she received in professional spaces as similar to Reddit threads that are really white supremacist and incel-y and all that. And she felt that because of the position she was in, she couldn't just shut it down immediately and instead had to be very thoughtful and diplomatic and graceful about it. Many participants also referenced Timnit Gebru in relation to this issue. So our key takeaways are that due to decoupling and the lack of leadership buy-in, there's a lack of organizational infrastructure and support to address AI ethics issues adequately and consistently. So instead, ethics entrepreneurs must rely on influence and charismatic authority rather than formal structure in an environment that prioritizes product and its associated performance metrics. Therefore, successful implementation of ethics is subject to the preferences of others, interpersonal dynamics, and constant reorganizations. Ethics entrepreneurs must push their agenda without meaningful infrastructural support, putting them in a position of high personal risk. And that risk may be particularly acute for those from marginalized backgrounds, which is ironic given the alleged aims of the field of AI ethics around equity. So our study offers some hope for institutional change in contrast to previous work in the field of AI ethics, thanks to ethics entrepreneurs who are able to implement some of their changes, though not all of them. It also shows that hiring marginalized people into roles that require them to contend with post-racial ideologies while facing undue risk to their own careers is likely to exacerbate existing representation and minority experiences. So diversity is already a problem in Silicon Valley. Black workers are a minority that comprises only 2% of the workforce of Silicon Valley's top 75 firms. So I want to just close and say thank you, especially to our funders, HAI at Stanford, and I'm happy to take any questions.